I'm Erin Matlock, the research agronomist with PGRO. Now looking forward to tell you about the crop protection findings over this past season. So to start off with, we'll go through some disease control strategies, then switch into weeds, and finally wrap up with some virus prevalence and aphid control measures. So one disease we'll talk about is chocolate spot in beans. This is highly encouraged by long periods of overcast and humid conditions. Winter beans obviously are more susceptible because of those conditions, especially under high plant populations. And your infection will start on the leaf, but can spread to stems and pods, as you can see on here. So your preventative sprays are essential when conditions are suitable for disease. The second bean disease we'll discuss will be bean rust. So this disease develops quickly, favored by your hot days and cool humid nights, which is what we experienced this past growing season. Yield reductions can be huge if the disease develops during late flowering and into pod set. Infections after pod development generally have little effect on yield, so fungicides should not need to be applied at this time. And rust can impact both spring and winter beans. So looking at our 2024 winter bean trial data, chocolate spot was not very prevalent in the trial, but we are seeing some infection differences. So your Lotus era as well as your Signum are providing pretty decent control compared to the untreated. So T1 was sprayed between the first two ratings, and T2 was sprayed between the second and third rating. So pretty decent control throughout the season as a whole. Then if we look at our winter bean rust, as I said, last year was a very strong rust year. So at the end of the year, we were seeing 100% rust in our untreated control. But beyond that, all controls were giving us 50 and under %. We did end up doing a third spray after these ratings, just as a maintenance spray because there's more rust coming in. But overall, all of our standard programs were holding pretty consistent last year. And then just to also give you a sneak peek of what's coming down the pipeline, we did have the opportunity to look at a few confidential trial products last year. These were the top two, and they're holding strong in the chocolate spot as well as the rest compared to industry standards. So there is still some work being done in our winter bean fungicide programs, which is always great to see. And of course, yield is king, so it's great if you're controlling disease, but if there's no truth in the yield, then that's not a good scenario. So all of our programs, including the confidentials, were better than the untreated. Now, amongst the treatments themselves, there wasn't a whole lot of difference, but as you can tell, there was 2 standards and 1 confidential that was significantly better than the untreated. So pretty decent yields, just sitting over that 5 ton per hectare. Now moving into our spring beans, I don't have any chocolate spot data. As mentioned earlier, spring beans generally do not see a lot of chocolate spot pressure, so we did not report any ratings. So looking at rust, here again, pretty strong rust pressure by the 12th of July, so we're sitting close to 70%. But all treatments were significantly lower than the untreated and provided pretty nice control, sitting around that 10% being the worst treatment. So our standard programs here again are doing pretty well on bean rust and spring beans. And then of course, here again, we're seeing some pretty strong yield responses to our rust fungicide program with the Lotus era and the azoxymetronidazole being significantly better than the Signum. And of course, all are better than the untreated. Now, we haven't had much downy mildew in the last 2 seasons, but with the loss of metalaxyl for this growing year, it would have been in very low supply, if any, left last year to be used, but this certainly is the first season that is not an option for downy mildew control. So going back to 2022, just to show that there is some options out there. Most of them are going to be part of your other programs anyways, but you are going to see some downy mildew control with your Lotus era, your Signum as well. Not so much with the Custodia, we are getting it with those other products. So do not be too concerned with the loss of the metalaxyl. So to wrap up bean diseases, resistance ratings are available for your downy mildew, rust, and chocolate spot on the descriptive list. The descriptive list is available in the winter issue of the Pulse magazine as well as on our website. Make sure you monitor early on for downy mildew, and there are options beyond the SL 567A. Make sure you stay on top of your chocolate spot. And your second fungicide application for chocolate spot, if it's required, should also be targeted for rust. So here is a very busy chart. This is also available on the website, but this is just a broad spectrum overview of all your fungicide options available for beans that gives you any restrictions, some harvest intervals, and then label claims for control. So it's a nice little wrap-up table to be utilized. Now moving on to peas, the first one we'll be looking at here is powdery mildew. This is more impactful on your late maturing crops, and their plants will become covered with a great white film. So you're already late maturing. This can also delay maturity even that much further, and there is varietal resistance out there. So looking at our 2024 trial program here, we had some pretty decent powdery mildew. End of the season, we were hitting close to 90% on our untreated. Now, the thing to really take note here is the last two treatments contain thiopron, which is a sulfur product. Our sulfur fungicides are definitely doing wonderful against the powdery mildew, so something to definitely include in the program if you are prone to powdery mildew. And then downy mildew is caused by your soil resting spores. Those will then infect your young pea plants. Then these plants will cause some secondary infection under cool, humid conditions. So here you're going to see it on the underside of the leaf start as gray mycelial growth, and then move on to your pods, which will cause your seeds to develop improperly. So the main defense mechanism is varietal resistance. There is no label claims for downy mildew control on fungicides. But we are still keeping track of it, seeing if there is a little bit out there, even though there's no label claims. So this past season wasn't huge. We're sitting around that 10% at the end of the season on the pods. And the plants were sitting at that 3%. Now this could come down to varietal resistance there. I actually haven't looked to see what variety this trial was under. But if we just look at the pods itself, your azoxystrobin products are giving you significant control compared to the untreated. So if you are going for botrytis per se, you might be getting some downy mildew control at the same time. So in generally for combating diseases in your combining peas, you really want to be looking at your varietal resistance for downy mildew as well as powdery mildew. And then also test your seed. This is the main mechanism to fight against leaf and pod spot, and we can test that for you. Botrytis is also favored under wet conditions, especially at flowering, and this may require 1 or 2 applications of fungicides, especially around pod set. And as mentioned earlier, your powdery mildew could be occurring in your later maturing crops. And similar chart to what I showed for the beans, the summary is available on the PGRO website. So here's all your available fungicides, along with the harvest intervals and any label restrictions. And it's like I said, there's no label claims for downy mildew control, but we are seeing a little bit out there with our current fungicide programs. So switching gears, just talk briefly here about weeds. Hopefully this is no surprise to anybody, but peas and beans are very, very poor competitors, especially early on. So to combat that, the best thing we can be doing is to control the weeds in the previous crop as much as possible. And if all else fails, make sure you start with a stale seedbed and get these crops off to a running start without any weeds present. The majority of our herbicides are pre-emergent, and if you are spraying drilling, you've got to be monitoring soil moisture, as there needs to be soil moisture for the pre-ems to work properly. So here's your pre-emergent herbicide options across your winter beans, spring beans, combining peas, and I have just included binding peas in here just as an aside. So they're approved across most crops. The big exception is propyzamide. So your curved flow is only available in winter beans, and the label final date of application is February 1st. Now, if you go combining peas, they do have a standalone label for pendimethalin, and then binding peas, you've also got your fossulfocarb. Now, your post-stem herbicides, approved across most of them, except when it comes to MCPB, it's only available in your combining binding peas. And then binding peas also have the option of using clethodim. So when we start looking at hard to control weeds, now whether it's hard to control, whether they're just competitive, or they're just very prevalent out there across rotation as a whole. So I just grabbed 5 examples here. Blackgrass is always in the news. It's always hard to control. Soon this will be Italian ryegrass. So as you can tell in the terms of the preamp, so that's from the red line up, your only real option is propyzamide. And that is only available in winter beans. So you really got to get that weed under control prior to coming into peas and beans. And then if you go into post-emergent, you've got the FOP chemistry. It does work all right under proper conditions, but it's still not the best option. It is the only option, but it's not the best solution if you can get ahead of it in previous crops. Now, in terms of your broadleafs, you got your fathead, bindweed, black nightshade, and cleavers. Not a whole lot post-emergent other than your bazagran. So you're going to control these in your pre-emergents. If you are known to have cleavers as a post-emergent control, make sure you go full label rate on the bazagran and don't do a split application. So that was a short summary on the weeds. There is lots of data, lots of information out there, so please ask away once we get to that point. Rolling into peas and bean viruses, this is very busy. I know that. But the main takeaway from that is to notice that the majority vectors of transmission is by our peach and potato aphid, the pea aphids, as well as the black bean aphids. And most of them are on our beans and our peas combined. So looking at a couple of these individually, we've got the bean leaf roll virus. As mentioned before, this is transmitted by aphids. And your infection becomes more obvious when the infestation happens prior to flowering. So you're going to see some stunted plants, your leaves will be thickened, and as you can see in this picture, they'll also be rolling upwards. And this all leads to significant reduction in pod set, and you can have a yield loss of 50 to 90%. So pretty significant if it gets a hold into the crop. The other one is bean yellow mosaic virus. Now this one can develop anytime prior to flowering, and also keep in mind peas are a host. So your leaves are going to become crinkled as opposed to rolling like the previous one, and you can get some vein clearing. But there's not going to be translucent spotting like you're going to get in the pea nation mosaic virus. So that's how you can tell the difference between the two. And here your pea aphid is the principal vector, but it can also be transmitted by black bean aphids. And so pea nation virus is one of the most prevalent viruses in terms of symptomology we can see in UK peas. Field beans are also a host. So your leaves are going to develop a mosaic mottled symptom at the top of the plant, and you're going to see some vein clearing occur. And then as you can see in the bottom picture, the veins can also become fairly ridged and almost has some scaly structures on it. Your pods and peas will become malformed, causing that yield loss. Pea seed-borne mosaic virus, this is not have initial transmission by your aphids. It gets established by infected seed and then transmitted via the winged aphids in early spring. So your leaves are going to be rolled and pale, pods are small, and your seeds are going to start to look like a tennis ball. Your main means to prevent infection on this is to get your seed tested. Now, turnip yellow virus, this is a very persistent virus that is transmitted by aphids. When the survey was conducted in 2019 and 2022, along with AHDB, this was the most prevalent virus found in pea crops. Now, the issue with this is there is no symptoms that we can see in our UK peas, hence no picture on the slide. but it is able to cause up to a yield loss of 40%. So it's one of those silent yield robbers out there. The only means to protect against it is getting rid of our aphids, or controlling the aphids, I should say. It's not known to be found in UK field beans. Now, beans are a host. The main reason we may not have found it yet is because there has not been an extensive survey done in our field beans like there has been in the peas. So one way to control our aphids is to monitor them. So Rothamsted Insect Survey gives us seasonal updates. You can sign up for aphid alerts. It's just going to give you general flight patterns. The general rule of thumb is once the aphids are first recorded and the suction cups through Rothamsted, they're going to be present in the crop a few days later. The website is on here. Definitely get yourself signed up to get some alerts. But there's nothing wrong with boots on the ground. So your in-field inspections are going to help you identify those early onset aphid infestations. Those may even occur prior to the aphid alert through Rothamsted. So still keep an eye on the field. Another way is cultural control methods. So the main mechanism here is our wildflower margins. So these margins are going to be promoting natural enemies and giving an additional enhancement of early season activity of parasistoids and carabid beetles. Keep in mind, this is also under an SFI scheme, and you can get 798 pounds per hectare per year under this SFI. So what we found in 2023 is closer to the wildflower margins, the lower the aphid populations. So that's just those natural enemies taking care of the aphids. And that will in turn hopefully lower virus transmissions, which will also have less of a yield impact. Which leads into work that was also done previously. No, this one was done in peas. And here again, the closer we were to the wildflower margins, the less aphids, the higher yield. So it's definitely a nice control method for aphids out there. But if need be, there's always chemical control options if required. So your economic thresholds is really going to depend on the value of your crop as well as the cost of the chemical. So your black bean aphids in general, we're saying if 10% of the plants are colonized, you should consider spraying. Now, applications made at early flowering are going to reduce your aphid transmitted virus infections. Now, when we come and look at pea aphids, if you're wanting to have virus management, as soon as you see a site of aphids, you should be considering chemical control measures, especially if it's humid out. Now, if you're not too concerned about viruses, but you don't want to have your plant fed on, then your threshold is 20% for combining peas and 15% for vining peas. So looking at the 2024 data on pea aphids, as you can tell, it doesn't look like there's strong numbers there at 3.5 per plant, but that still is a decent amount of population to get some data. So all products were doing fairly well. The standout products was any treatments containing aphox. So that's a pretty decent aphid control measure out there. These other ones are right in line as well. And here again, we have a summary chart of all insecticides available for combining peas. Please take note of when you cannot be applying these on flowering plants. There's a lot of restrictions around that for product, but most of them are going to control your pea aphid. And then same thing with your field beans. I don't have any data on black bean aphid control because they are fairly easy to control. The main restriction on these is our time of application is trying to get stuff from out there prior to flowering because there is a lot of restrictions at that stage. And just as a friendly reminder, cruiser treated sugar beet fields in the last few years, you got to be watching crop restrictions. So you're essentially looking at 32 months to be growing peas and beans. I'm sure everybody's well aware of this, but just putting that at the forefront again as a friendly reminder. And this past few months, the PGRO Monitor app has had a makeover, so definitely download the new version on Google or Apple Store. And here you're going to see a lot more detailed different pests, diseases, deficiencies on all crops, including some of the novel protein crops. And here you can also send a report when you see your aphids, when you see your viruses, or if there's something in the field that you aren't familiar with it, take a picture and send in the report. So it's definitely been a nice overhaul of that app. And finally, PMBN. Don't forget to get involved in the PMBN network. This is definitely a way to benchmark your crop and also enhance your crop performance. Thank you.